Pot of Greed. Card type, spell, property, normal. Draw 2 cards. Card trivia, Pot of Greed. The pot in this card's artwork appears in the artworks of AI Mine, Asleep at the Switch, Avatar of the Pot, Cashback, Counter Cleaner, Dark Spirit Art Greed, Dice of Greed, End of the Line as a hologram, Exchange, Extra Buck, Fine, Giant Tortoise of Greed, Goblin Circus, Goblin of Greed, Goblin Out of the Frying Pan, Greed Grado, Jackpot 7, Jar Robber, Mistaken Arrest, Moray of Greed, One by One, Panic Shuffle, Peeking Goblin, Progress Potter, Redeemable Jar, Return, The Shard of Greed, Single Purchase, Spellbooks from the Pot, Spirits of the Pot of Greed, and The Gift of Greed. This pot also appears as one of the halves of Pot of Duality, Pot of Desires, and Pot of Extravagance, both in terms of card artwork and effects. This card has a parody counterpart, Pot of Generosity. This card's artwork appears in the artwork of Greed Pact. This card has the second shortest effect text of any other card, after Jar of Greed. Though this card has been forbidden in the TCG since October 2005 and the OCG since March 2006, it has continued to receive homage through other cards, such as Shard of Greed and Moray of Greed. It also has direct counterparts which imitate its effect in more balanced manners and/or with more contextual purposes. Such cards include Reckless Greed, Allure of Darkness, Red Dragon Vase, Solar Recharge, Trade-In, Rare Value, Pendulum Halt, Spellbook of Knowledge, Sekka's Light, Orchestrated, Return, and Cards of Consonance. This card makes it similar to the infamous Magic the Gathering card Black Lotus, a card that was retroactively banned for its lack of balance, but repeatedly referenced since then by later, more measured counterparts. This card's effect is one of the 4 effects of forbidden cards emulated by Fa-Rin Kazan, though it was not yet forbidden at the time of the card's release, and the Pot of the Forbidden. This card is one of many forbidden cards whose status is referenced in the artwork of other cards, sometimes alongside other forbidden cards. For example, its appearance in the artwork of Mistaken Arrest depicts it as contraband, which leads to the arrest of Sangan. The Red Fiend from Delinquent Duo and the Angel from Graceful Charity. When the pot is found inside the cab the fiend was driving. According to the Master Guide, someone can put their hand inside the Pot of Greed and find something that will delight them, but the pot will explode once they take their hand out. This card was used frequently in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and was frequently used in the first 2 seasons of the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime, when it was used by nearly every main protagonist and antagonist until it was last used in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 104, Future Changes. It was during March of 2006 that this card was forbidden in the OCG, and it has remained forbidden since. However, this card's Rush Duel counterpart has appeared in both the anime and manga since the Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's anime. This card has also become a popular meme for the fact that its effect is explained verbatim almost every time it is used, despite having one of the shortest and easiest to understand card texts. Card appearances: Pot of Greed, manga, Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel 256, Duelist Duel 197, God vs. God, Dark Yugi uses this card in his duel against Seto Kaiba, setting it on his field. When Kaiba declares an attack against Yugi's Slifer the Sky Dragon, using his The God of the Obelisk, Yugi activates this set card to draw 2 cards, thus increasing Slifer's attack by 2,000. Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Chapter 3, the legendary dragon Jaden Yuki uses this card during his duel against Chaz Princeton. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Chapter 9, Best Friends, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Cyrus Truesdale, drawing Elemental Hero Voltec and Hero Solidarity. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Chapter 12, Duelist Instinct, Koyo Hibiki uses this card during Jaden's flashback of their duel together, drawing Polymerization and Elemental Hero Lady Heat. In the next chapter, he returns it to his hand via the effect of his Elemental Hero Inferno, and uses it again. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Chapter 42, The End of the Battle, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Reggie McKenzie, drawing Elemental Hero Lady Heat and Winged Karibo. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Chapter 63, The Threat of the Sun, Jaden uses this card during his tag duel with Chaz against Tragodia, drawing Construct Element and Miracle Fusion. Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend, Supremacy 10, The Man Who Sits on the Throne, Luke uses this card during his duel against Sebastian to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend, Supremacy 12, The Man Who Rebels Against Providence, Luke uses this card during his duel against Nehru Saionji to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend, Supremacy 13, The Ant Entertainment Man, Luke uses this card during his duel against Django Arisugawa to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend, Supremacy 15, The Man Who Turned Down a Duel, Luke uses this card during his duel against Asana Mutsuba to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Luke Explosive Supremacy Legend, Supremacy 17, The Mean-Spirited Man, Luke uses this card during his duel against Yuga Odo to draw 2 cards. Anime Yu-Gi-Oh! Battle City Part 1. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 65, Mime Control Part 1. This card is shown in String's hand during his duel against Yami-Yugi while the former was possessed by Merik Ishtar. In the next episode, Strings activates this card to draw 2 cards. This increases the attack and defense of Slifer the Sky Dragon from 2,000 to 3,000. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 68, Legendary Fisherman Part 1, Seto Kaiba uses this card during his tag duel with Yami-Yugi against Rare Hunter 2 and Rare Hunter 3 to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 72, Double Duel Part 3, Loomis uses this card during his tag duel with Umbra against Yugi and Kaiba to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episodes 85, Rage of the Egyptian Gods, this card can be seen when Yugi is rebuilding his deck. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 90, Mind Game Mai vs. Merik Part 1, Yami Merik uses this card during his duel against Mai Valentine to draw 2 cards. The 2 cards he drew were Jam Defender and Remove Trap. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 96, Showdown in the Shadows Part 1, this card is shown in Yami Merik's hand during his duel against Yami Bakura. In the next episode, this card is still shown to be in Yami Merik's hand. Virtual World. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 102, Freeze Play Part 1, this card can be seen in Taya Gardner's hand during her duel against Crump. She banishes this card and Petite Angel from her hand in order to activate the flip effect of Fire Sorcerer. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 105, Courtroom Chaos Part 2, Johnson and Joey Wheeler both use this card during their duel against each other. Johnson activates this card to draw 2 cards. Joey then activates Gamble to toss a coin. Joey calls heads, but Johnson cheats by changing the result to tails. This meant Joey had to skip his next turn. Later, Joey activates his own copy of this card to draw 2 cards, Burning Soul Sword and Arduous Decision. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 108, Settling the Score Part 1, this card is seen in Kaiba's hand during his duel against Lecter. In the next episode, Kaiba activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 112, Merger of the Big Five Part 2, Lecter uses this card during the Big Five's duel against Yami-Yugi and Joey to draw 2 cards. Since Lecter activated a magic card, Yugi's Volscath gains 200 attack through its own effect. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 115, Brothers in Arms Part 2, Seto Kaiba uses this card during his duel against Noah Kaiba to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 116, Brothers in Arms Part 3, this card appears in a flashback Seto has when he remembers that he promised to be a father to Mokuba Kaiba and protect him no matter what. Although Seto initially threw Mokuba out, he did so to ensure that no matter what happened to him, Mokuba would still have a family. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 121, Burying the Past Part 2, Seto Kaiba uses this card during his duel against Gozaburo Kaiba to draw 2 cards. Battle City Part 2, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 122, Back to Battle City Part 1, this card is shown in Kaiba's hand during the battle royale between himself, Yami Yugi, Joey, and Yami Merrick. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 130, Clash in the Coliseum Part 2, Yami Yugi sets this card during his duel against Kaiba. In the next episode, Yami Yugi activates this set card to draw 2 cards. This increases the attack and defense of Slifer the Sky Dragon. Attack and defense from 3,000 to 5,000. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 136, Battle for the Bronze Part 2, Joey uses this card during his duel against Kaiba to draw 2 cards. Waking the Dragons. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 150, Deja Duel Part 2, Alistair uses this card during his duel against Kaiba to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 154, My Freaky Valentine Part 3, it's revealed that before Maximilian Pegasus had his soul stolen by Mai, he leaves a special card to help Yugi defeat Darts in a secret room inside a life-sized pot of greed. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 157, Fate of the Pharaoh Part 2, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Raphael to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 159, Trial by Stone, this card is shown when Weevil Underwood and Rex Raptor are taken to a vault within Paradisius' headquarters that contain copies of every card in existence with the exception of the legendary dragons and the Egyptian gods. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 162, On the Wrong Track, Part 3, Joey uses this card during his duel against Rex to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 167, Flight of Fear, Part 2, Kaiba uses this card during his duel against Alistair to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 176, Grappling with a Guardian, Part 3, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Raphael to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 179, A Duel with Darts, Part 3, Seto Kaiba uses this card during his tag duel with Yami Yugi against Darts to draw 2 cards. 2 episodes later, Yami Yugi activates this card to draw 2 cards. Grand Championship. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 188, Let the Games Begin, Part 2, Joey uses this card in his duel against Solomon Moto, while the latter was disguised as Apnarg Otum. He uses this card to draw 2 cards, Giant Trunade and Premature Burial. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 190, Down in Flames, Part 1, Siegfried von Schroeder uses this card during his duel against Joey to draw 2 cards, Valkyrie's Duet and Erda's Guidance. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 193, A Brawl in a Small Town, Part 2, Rebecca Hawkins uses this card during her duel against Leon von Schroeder to draw 2 cards. Later, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Vivian Wong to draw 2 cards. Because Yami Yugi activated a spell card, his skilled Dark Magician gains a spell counter through its own effect. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 194, One Step Ahead Part 1, Seto Kaiba uses this card during his duel against Siegfried to draw 2 cards. In the next episode, Siegfried activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 197, Sinister Secrets Part 2, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Leon to draw 2 cards. Since Yami Yugi draws Wadapon through this card's effect, he special summons Wadapon via its own effect. Later, Leon uses his own copy to draw 2 cards. Pharaoh's Memories. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 200, A Spiritual Awakening, Yami Bakura uses this card during his duel against Kaiba to draw 2 cards. This card also appears within Yami Yugi's mind when Yami Bakura claims that his mind is an unsolvable maze, and that he pursues games like riddles. This card also appears within Kaiba's briefcase when he opens it up and takes his duel disc with him. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 216, The Dark One Cometh Part 2, Yami Bakura uses this card during his duel against Yugi Moto to draw 2 cards. Later, this card became a phantom after Yami Bakura gained the black box from the effect of Cursed Twin Dolls. The phantom of this card also appears in the following episode. Battle Ritual, Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode 222, The Final Duel Part 2, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Yugi to draw 2 cards. This increases the attack and defense of Slifer from 2,000 to 3,000. In the next episode, Yugi activates this card to draw 2 cards. Since Yugi draws Wadapon through this card's effect, he special summons Wadapon via its own effect. Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, 7 stars. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 5, The Shadow Duelist Part 1, Jaden Yuki uses this card during his duel against Titan. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 7, Duel and Unusual Punishment, Cyrus Truesdale uses this card during his practice duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 8, For the Sake of Cyrus, this card can be seen when Chumley Huffington is rebuilding his deck while sitting in a tree. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 11, Tag Team Trial, Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his tag duel with Cyrus against Para and Dox. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 14, Spirit Summoned, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Jinzo. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 16, The Duel Giant, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Beauregard. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 17, Nature of the Draw, 2 copies of this card are shown in Damon's flashback, where it was shown going down a waterfall as part of Damon's training montage. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 19, The King of the Copycats, Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Dimitri, while the latter was using Yugi's deck. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 21, The Duel Off, Part 1, during Bastian Misawa's duel against Jaden, this card can be seen in Bastian's deck while he is searching it via the effect of Hydrogeddon. In the next episode, Bastian activates this card to draw 2 cards. This card is later shown as one of the 10 cards that are piled on top of Carbodendon in Bastian's graveyard. In the first above-mentioned episode, this card can be seen when Jaden is rebuilding his deck. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 23, The Little Belowski, Belowski uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 26, The School Duel Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Chaz Princeton. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 27, Grave Risk Part 1, Gravekeeper's Chief uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He activates this card to draw 2 cards. In the next episode, Jaden uses his own copy of this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 30, Doomsday Duel Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Nightshroud. He activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 32, Field of Screams Part 2, Zane Truesdale uses this card during his duel against Gamula. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 33, Field of Screams Part 3, Camula and Jaden both use this card during their duel against each other. Camula activates this card on the 4th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. On the last turn of the duel, Jaden activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 34, The Fear Factor, Kaiba Man uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 35, Sibling Rivalry, Chaz excavates this card, Ojama Yellow, Ojama Green, and Ojama Black via the effect of Enchanting Fitting Room during his duel against Slade Princeton. As this card was not a level 3 or below normal monster, it was returned to Chaz's deck. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 38, Get Your Game On, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Tanya. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 39, The Dark Scorpions, Don Zalug and Chaz both use this card during their duel against each other. Don Zalug uses this card during the third turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. On the last turn of the duel, Chaz uses his own copy. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 40, A Lying Legend, Abydos III uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 41, A Reason to Win, Alexis Rhodes uses this card during her duel against Titan. She uses this card to draw Fusion Recovery and the Warrior Returning Alive. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 44, The Seventh Shadow Rider, this card is seen in the remains of Chaz's deck when Jaden, Cyrus, and Chumley find it. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 46, Amnael's Endgame Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Amnael. He uses this card to draw Clay Wrap and Polymerization. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 47, Chazanova, Chaz uses this card during his duel against Alexis. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 48, Rise of the Sacred Beasts Part 1, Jaden and Kagamaru both use this card during their duel against each other. Jaden activates this card on the 5th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. Later, Kagamaru activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 50, Magna Cum Laude, Violin Crowler uses this card during his duel against Chumley Huffington. He uses this card to draw Ancient Gear Factory and Ancient Gear Drill. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 52, The Graduation Match Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Zane. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. Society of Light. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 54, Champion or Chazbin, Reginald Van Howell III and Chaz both use this card during their duel against each other. Reggie activates this card on the 3rd turn of the duel to draw Armed Samurai Ben Kai and a Great Sword. Later, Chaz activates this card to draw Ojamandala and Ojama Delta Hurricane. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 55, A Hassleberry Hounding, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Tyranno Hassleberry. He activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 57, The Demon, Aster Phoenix and Zane both use this card during their duel against each other. Aster activates this card during the 3rd turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. Later, Zane activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 58, A New Breed of a Hero Part 1, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Aster. He activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 60, Pop Goes the Duel, Alexis uses this card during her duel against Atticus Rhodes. She activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 62, A Greater Porpoise, Jaden uses this card during his duel against the Alien of Light. He uses this card to draw Elemental Hero Neos and Contact. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 63, Curry Worries, Satyr uses this card during his duel against Hassleberry. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 65, No Pain, No Game, Mad Dog uses this card during his duel against Zane. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 68, Homecoming Duel Part 2, Jaden and Aster both use this card during his duel against each Aster. Jaden activates this card on the 6th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. Later, Aster activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 70, Obelisk White, Alexis uses this card during her duel against Chaz. She uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 72, Not Playing with a Full Deck, Howard X. Miller uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 74, Happily Never After, Princess Rose and Jaden both use this card during their duel against each other. Rose activates this card on the 5th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. On the last turn of the duel, Jaden uses his own copy. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 75, Taken by Storm, Part 1, Hassleberry uses this card during his tag duel with Cyrus against Frost and Thunder. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 77, J-Dog and T-Bone, T-Bone uses this card during his duel against Jaden. He uses this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 78, Mirror Mirror Part 1, Jaden uses this card to draw 2 cards during his tag duel with Aster against Starina and Starina's duplicate. Later, Aster uses this card, his own copy, to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 80, What a Doll, Jaden uses this card to draw 2 cards during his duel against Alice. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 82, Magnetic Personality, Chaz uses this card to draw 2 cards during his duel against Bastion. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 83, Schooling the Master, Chancellor Shepard and Zane both use this card during their duel against each other. Shepard activates this card on the 5th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. On the last turn of the duel, Zane activates his own copy, revealing the limiter removal and creature swap he drew to Shepard due to the effect of his own Cyber Esper. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 84, Generation Next, Cyrus uses this card during his duel against a Slifer Red student. He uses this card to draw Expressroid and Vehicroid Connection Zone. Later, Prince Ocean uses this card during his duel against Sartorius. He uses this card to draw Satellite Cannon and Cost Down. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 85, Rah Rah Rah, Jaden uses this card to draw 2 cards during his duel against Franz. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 86, The Art of the Duel, Orlando uses this card to draw 2 cards during his duel against Jaden. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 88, Blinded by the Light, Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Chaz to draw Polymerization and Mystic Walk. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 89, The Darkness Within, during Zane's duel against Atticus, this card can be seen in the air after Zane activates Power Wall and throws his deck out to block the damage he would have taken. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 90, Pro Dueling, Damon uses this card during his duel against Mathematica to draw 2 cards. Later, Alexis uses this card during her duel against Mater D to just draw 2 cards. After Alexis ritual summons Cyber Angel Itaden, she activates its effect to add this card from her graveyard to her hand. She then activates this card again to draw 2 more cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 94, Heart of Ice, Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Alexis to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 95, Tough Love, Cyrus and Zane both use this card during their duel against each other. Cyrus activates this card on the 6th turn of the duel to draw 2 cards. Later, Zane activates this card to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 96, It's All Relative, Dr. Eisenstein uses this card during his duel against Jaden to draw 2 cards. Eisenstein then uses the effect of Schrodinger's cat to shuffle the 2 cards he just drew back to his deck and draw 2 new cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Episode 98, Ultimate Destiny, Aster uses this card in his duel against the D. It is sent from the top of his deck to the graveyard by the effect of Destiny Hero Diamond Dude during the main Phase 1 of Aster's next turn. He activates this card's effect via the effect of Diamond Dude. drawing 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX episode 103, The Hands of Justice Part 2, Jaden uses this card during his duel against Sartorius to draw Elemental Hero Neos and O Oversoul. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX episode 104, Future Changes, Jazz uses this card during his duel against Blair Flanagan. He uses this card to draw 2 new cards. Dimension World. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX episode 107, A Jewel of a Duel Part 2, this card can be seen at the bottom of Jesse Anderson's deck during his duel against Jaden. In Yu-Gi-Oh! GX episode 164, The Inherited Cyberdark Dragon, this card is shown in a series of flashbacks Cyrus has when he deduces that Zane's problems came from his deck, not the underground dueling he was involved with. Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's Team Battle Royale. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 52, Battle Royale Finale, Luke uses this card during his rush duel against Yuga Oto to draw 2 cards. Goha 6 Siblings. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 62, The Luke Man uses this card during his rush duel against Yuo Goha to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 63, President Luke, Luke uses this card during his rush duel against Roa Cassidy to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 64, Fear the Gear, the Luke Man uses this card during his rush duel against Tiger to draw 2 cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 66, Rise of the Supervillain, the Luke Man uses this card during his rush duel against Yuga Oto to draw 2 cards. In the next episode, he places this card alongside Fusion and Dragon's Return on the bottom of his deck to use the effect of Peace Dragon, making both players gain 1,000 life points. Goha Employee. In Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 73, Lose to Win, Luke uses this card during his rush duel against Yuga Oto to draw 2 cards. King of Duels. From Yu-Gi-Oh! 7's episode 89, Tiger Tamer, Luke uses this card during his rush duel against Tiger to draw 2 cards. Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, second arc. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode 20, Yuna Goha uses this card. This card's artwork appears in a card shop display. Third arc, a model of the pot appears in Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush episode 27. It's tough making an anime. Films, Yu-Gi-Oh! The movie Pyramid of Light. In Yu-Gi-Oh! The movie Pyramid of Light, Yami Yugi uses this card during his duel against Kaiba to draw 2 cards. Since Yugi drew Wadapon through this card's effect, he special summons Wadapon via its own effect. According to the deck lists in the novelization, Pegasus and Kaiba had this card in their decks. Video games, Jaden Yuki, Cyrus Truesdale, Alexis Rose, Chaz Princeton, Bastian Misawa, Zane Truesdale, Violin Crowler, Lyman Banner, Atticus Rhodes, Tanya, Donzalug, Abydos III, Titan, Amniel, Kagamaru, Damon, Jasmine, Blair Flanagan, Dark Magician Girl, Jinzo, Sadie, Slade Princeton, Jagger Princeton, Yasmin, Night Shroud, Mimicry, George, Hose, Dean, Leo Side, Joshua, Lawrence, Yan, Fati, Craig, Pippin, Deron, Enzo, Swin, Deloge, Viga, Rune, Marcel, Pablo, Matthew, Corey, Simon, Nova, Rock, Dante, Truly, Brown, Sadina, Woody, Hyde, Jamie, Soon, Anka, Ree, Maki, Celia, Disa, Masha, Jules, Andrea, Lily, Yumi, Inoso, Emperor, Umiuma, Mokuma, Sanjomi, and Cyronos use this card in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force. Scripted duels. In the non-canon duel North American WCQ 2011 Special, Yugi vs. Yusei, Yugi activates this card. In YCS Providence 2012 Special, My Joey and Yugi vs. Pegasus and Bakura, Pegasus, Joey, Yugi, and Bakura all activate this card. In North American WCQ 2012 Special, Joey vs. Kaiba, Kaiba activates this card on his first turn. The next turn, Joey targets this card with Grave Robber, activating it as his own card. Later, Joey picks up his own copy from his deck and adds it to his hand. Due to the flip effect of Kaiba's Cyberjar, Joey activates this copy on his next turn. In North American WCQ 2013 Special Kaiba vs. Pegasus, Kaiba activates this card. In World Championship 2013 Special Mai vs. Yugi, Yugi activates this card. Since Yugi drew Wadapon through this card's effect, he special summons Wadapon through its own effect. Later, Mai activates her own copy of this card. In North American WCQ 2014 Special Astral vs. Yugi, Yugi activates this card on his first turn. This card's activation gives Yugi's Skilled Dark Magician its second spell counter. In North American WCQ 2015 Special Merrick vs. Pegasus, this card is in Pegasus's opening hand and is revealed when Merrick activates Royal Tribute on the first turn. The next turn, Pegasus activates this card, drawing Toon Mask Sorcerer and Shard of Greed. In YCS Origins 2016 Special Joey vs. Pegasus, Joey activates this card, drawing Sixth Sense and Polymerization.